How is mental health related to concussions?
Why are patient perspectives important when determining interventions?
What research needs to be done to better current clinical practice guidelines for concussions?
What are barriers for family doctors when implementing new screening guidelines?
Hello and welcome to Raincoat.
My name is Isabelle,
And I'm Sarah.
and we are excited to share how academia, industry, and communities can work together on complex problems and improve knowledge translation.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Raincoat. Today we have two very exciting guests. We have Dr. Noah Silverberg and Thalia here to talk to us about all things concussion. But before we dive into the research and all the good stuff, I think it'd be a little fun to do a lightning round of questions to get to know who our guests are. So, first question, Noah, if you could instantly become an expert in something, what would it be and why?
Ooh, maybe urban design. Just very aware of homelessness and related problems in our city, and would love to be able to contribute towards a solution to that.
Interesting. Talia, how about you?
I would say cooking. I love food, but I often have to go out and pay for it. I do cook here, but I would love to learn how to cook gourmet meals at home.
Both are such great responses. Okay, and Noah, what is your favorite book?
My favorite book, uh, anything by Malcolm Gladwell, for sure. Braiding Sweetgrass is probably the last one I just read that was amazing.
Okay. And Talia, how about you?
Back in the day when I used to read, and not just read research articles, I loved John Grisham, so legal thrillers. I think I've read most of his books, but my favorite one has been The Bleachers.
Love John Grisham. We love it. Okay, I feel like I know you two a little bit more beyond just your titles and your role as a grad student, so we'll proceed.
So, Noah, you're an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at UBC. Before that, you're a PhD in clinical neuropsychology. You actually even worked as a psychologist. So, can you tell us more about the decision of combining your psychologist skill set with rehab science?
Yeah, I think it came about pretty early on in my training. So, in a clinical PhD program, you do placements in healthcare settings. And one of my earliest was at the Rehabilitation Institute of Michigan in Detroit, in their stroke and brain injury units. And just, yeah, getting involved in patient care at a time when they're getting better and putting their lives back together after what is often a catastrophic injury was fascinating and rewarding. And I sort of never looked back, sort of finished graduate school and started my career knowing that I wanted to apply what I know about psychology and helping people in a rehabilitation setting.
So you said you're fascinated about that process. What is the research that you're most fascinated about at the moment?
Yeah, much of my research focuses on psychological contributions to recovery and integrating psychological interventions into rehabilitation. And most of that is focused on concussion or mild traumatic brain injury.
Awesome. And Thalia, you did your bachelor's in McGill and then a master's at UBC, and now you're doing your PhD. Can you tell me a little bit more about all the things that you studied and kind of when that pivotal moment of you wanting to focus on concussion research happened?
Sure. After my bachelor's, I took a few years. I was actually working in the business world, but I used to play a lot of soccer, and I got my fourth concussion playing, and that took me a good 2 years to feel like myself again after the injury. And I realized, maybe a year after my injury, that I had developed some anxiety after my injury that was actually preventing me from, returning back to life as I knew it. But the problem was that not a lot of, the doctors that I had seen had suggested or knew that maybe mental health was interfering with my recovery. So that's when I started looking into or reading about how mental health can affect recovery. I found Noah's work and got really interested in that. Convinced me to go back to school and do my master's, and eventually here I am doing my PhD in that topic.
So you really took it from personal experience and carrying it out in your research. Now, I have two things that I just want to make sure I heard correctly. You had your fourth concussion, and that was the one that took 2 years-ish to recover, like fourth.
Yeah.
Did I hear that right?
Yeah, I mean, I probably, I've recovered from the injury itself like much sooner than the 2 years, but I think the recovery made me develop some mental health issues that took me, the 2 years to actually bounce back from. So yes, you heard right.
Okay, so we hear a lot the word concussion, but when we read about your research interest, Noah and Thalia, we also read a lot about mild traumatic brain injury. So can you help us out here and define what's the difference? What is concussion? What's mild traumatic brain injury? Or is it the same?
Unfortunately, not all experts agree on that very simple question. From my perspective, they are one and the same. I use the terms synonymously. Others reserve the word concussion to refer to an even milder form of traumatic brain injury than what might otherwise be referred to as mild traumatic brain injury. But in the grand scheme, so a traumatic brain injury involves some hard blow or other force that shakes the brain within the skull. And it can range from just a momentary disruption in brain function that completely resolves, all the way to a catastrophic injury involving prolonged coma and brain swelling and bleeding and associated long-term problems and disability. So on that, considering that broad spectrum, concussion is definitely on the milder side of it and might overlap partially or entirely with mild traumatic brain injury, depending on how you use that term.
So how do you define mild in your studies?
Yeah, a lot of people don't like the word mild because it makes it sound like a trivial injury that people quickly and fully recover from and get on with their lives, and that's often not the case. So it's a bit of a misnomer in that way. Mild is really just intended to differentiate it from a traumatic brain injury that will keep somebody in a hospital for weeks or even months and be left with serious disabilities to the point where they can't take care of themselves. So yeah, that's really what it means.
Okay, but is there kind of a typical population or a specific group where they're at higher risk for concussion or mild traumatic brain injury than the regular general population?
Definitely. So what we hear a lot in the news and magazines and such is about athletes and sport-related concussion. They make up only a minority of adults who sustain concussions. Not all of us are playing elite sports at a competitive level, especially contact sports where the rates of concussion are higher. And it's also just not the most popular sports like American football and hockey, where certainly the concussion rates are high, but even others like uh, equestrian and cheerleading, see pretty high concussion rates there as well. But as I said, for the majority of adults who get a concussion, it's not from sports, it's really from daily life, from slipping and falling, from standing position or downstairs, or being in a motor vehicle accident or bicycle crash. There are people who are more susceptible. Obviously, military service members and veterans and other frontline personnel are at higher risk for injuries of all kinds, including concussion. There's also been a lot more awareness lately on intimate partner violence, and the majority of victims are women sustaining an injury at the hands of their so-called loved one.
Okay, so now that we know kind of the difference, or I guess similarity between concussions and traumatic brain injuries, what are, I guess, the symptoms of having a concussion or mild TBI?
They're variable. Not everybody experiences the same symptoms, but some of the more common in the acute stage, this is hours to days following injury, include headache and dizziness and fatigue, difficulty concentrating, feeling sensitive to bright lights and loud noises, difficulty remembering things. So, yeah, those would be the more common.
But when should people be worried about it?
When should people get worried about the symptoms they're experiencing after a concussion?
Yeah, I guess when do you know it is really a concussion and you should go to the doctor?
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer because the symptoms of concussion overlap and are difficult to distinguish sometimes between a blow to the head that jolts your vestibular system in your inner ear but doesn't actually affect your brain. Or an orthopedic injury like a fracture of a long bone that's really painful. That can result in overlapping symptoms, or the more traumatic stress of some kind of threatening situation where your body and brain is not actually injured, but the situation itself is very traumatic. Maybe there's a near death or near injury experience, and the symptoms of stress can also overlap with concussion. So it's not always it's not always easy for people to tell. And I would just advise, when in doubt, go get checked out, whether that's with a family doctor or walk-in clinic, or if it feels like enough of an emergency at your local emergency department, and they'll be in the best position to help solve that mystery.
So do you have any resources that people can look up for concussion?
Well, the first visit should be either to your family doctor, or walk-in clinic, or an emergency department. Sometimes that's all people need. They'll recover on their own within days or weeks. Things just continue to get better and they don't need any additional formal treatment. When people do find that their symptoms are lingering and getting in the way of their returning to activities, that's probably the time to seek out additional help. Sometimes that's for very specific things like seeing a physiotherapist for neck pain. There are also specialty concussion clinics, both in the public and private sector, where you might be able to see a physician or an occupational therapist or other kinds of rehabilitation providers.
So, with these symptoms being so varied and being different for each person, is it possible to categorize these as kind of a short-term consequence versus a long-term consequence of concussion or traumatic brain injuries?
Well, I would say that the majority of people do make a complete recovery within the weeks following concussion. But there certainly all are exceptions, and it's been difficult to put a precise number on it, but probably something like at least 1 in 4 people have symptoms that linger beyond a month, and probably need that specialty care.
I think earlier we mentioned if they're assessed early, they can get the treatment for concussion. So, what is the current way of treating for concussion itself and not just the symptoms?
We have a pretty limited menu of evidence-based treatments to select from. Unfortunately, there's been an explosion of research over the past 10 or 20 years, but we're still not at a phase where there's a number of large-scale clinical trials that allow us to figure out what kind of treatments work and for who and when. So typically, people are initially advised to take it easy for a day or two and let their symptoms settle a bit, and then gradually start returning to their usual daily activities as they can tolerate. The next level of intervention would probably just be more education about the symptoms themselves and expected recovery trajectory, some recommendations for how to just self-manage the symptoms so that they're not so bothersome as somebody continues to recover. And then for people who have ongoing problems at that point, likely what they'll need is a combination of therapies targeting what their most significant problems are. For example, for headache, sometimes a combination of behavioral treatments and medications may be the thing. If dizziness is their bigger issue, or sleep difficulties, they would probably be offered treatments for those. So pretty symptom based.
Okay, and Thalia, for you, it took quite a while to manage your concussion. So can you give us some more details on what happens if it's not managed or treated correctly?
Sure. So what Noah just mentioned, that people typically get advised to take it easy or rest for 1 or 2 days after their injury. That wasn't always the case. Maybe, I don't know how many years ago it was now, but like 10 years ago, people took that advice to rest maybe a little too seriously, and would just, different clinicians, and I mean, I don't blame them, just because that was the knowledge at the time, would say just rest until you feel better. But as a patient who gets told to go in a dark room and gauge whether or not they feel better in 2 days, that's when my, I guess, anxiety started to develop, just because I got really anxious of how I was feeling and if I was feeling any symptoms. So every time I would, go for a walk, I would just question, am I feeling okay? Am I feeling symptoms? And that almost started like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where I would just like start to feel things and just convince myself that I hadn't recovered. Um, and it just kind of turned into a downward spiral. That I would say that maybe 6 months after my injury, I was doing worse than the month after my injury. So I guess that's part of the reason why I know your podcast focuses on knowledge translation, but speed up that process of translating knowledge as quickly as possible, just because in situations like the one I was in, it would have been helpful to know earlier that too much rest can actually prolong that recovery, just because, you're sitting in your dark room alone with your thoughts, and you're questioning whether or not you feel well. But the best course of action might just be to, gradually restart your activities as your symptoms allow, and just slowly get back to life that way, rather than sitting in a dark room for a month at a time waiting to feel better.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Even I had small concussions when I was younger, and the doctor's advice was always dark room, no computer, no reading, nothing. And it's so interesting for me that all the advice I've heard over the years is actually not advised. So yeah.
It's actually a really interesting history, I think. And it's one that's been repeated over and over for different health conditions over time. There seems to be this pattern of when we don't really understand a disease and its pathophysiology, we treat it with rest. It's sort of the default. It seems like a reasonable thing to do. And people probably don't fully appreciate that rest is a treatment that also can have adverse side effects and negative consequences.
Yeah.
So it came about for managing athletes who, were jumping to get back into their sport, and, resting for a day or two seemed like forever. And they're also, relatively young and healthy and tended to recover quickly. But when that advice sort of trickled down and permeated all sorts of clinical settings, patients of all sorts were told to rest until they get better, and that sort of took over as usual practice. And only later we learned that that's actually unhelpful. It's a bad idea, and we should stop it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, but if there are best practice recommendations out there for family doctors, what are the reasons that they're not followed consistently?
Well, probably some of the same reasons that most clinical practice guidelines are not followed consistently. I think some of it is perhaps unique to concussion, but much of it is not. I feel for family doctors that it's got to be next to impossible trying to keep up with the latest science and practice guidelines for pretty well every health condition known. And especially with concussion, one of the problems likely is that things have been changing relatively quickly, right? Compared to, heart disease and back pain and other conditions where things have changed, but I think over a longer time scale. Whereas most of the current concussion best practices, even 5 years ago, look quite different.
That's a perfect segue into talking about the M4 project. The full name, just once, mobilizing early management of mental health complications after mild traumatic brain injury. M4.
You got it.
So this project, yes. So this project looks at proactively identifying patients who are at risk for developing these mental health problems post-concussion, and then works with family physicians to educate them on these problems that may develop and treatment options and all of that. So all of that grouped into the kind of intervention, and this is compared to a control group / usual care. So just remind me, what is a typical usual care for post mild traumatic brain injury?
Yeah, in the context of this study, it just means sort of letting patients access whatever care they would under normal circumstances as if they weren't in the research study. The one difference here, and we should probably be calling it enhanced usual care, is that we are informing their doctor about the existence of clinical practice guidelines. So at the very least, we're sort of giving the heads up that, hey, in case you weren't aware, there are these practice guidelines. What we're not doing is going further to give tailored patient-specific advice based on those practice guidelines. That's what happens in the other arm of the study.
Okay, and speaking about arms, this study is a triple-blinded cluster randomized controlled trial. And for those of us who aren't the most familiar with study methodologies, that just looks like a lot of words. So can you just boil it down to what that really means?
Sure. So cluster randomized refers to the fact that in the study we are randomizing family physician clinics as opposed to individual patients or providers, as is done in other studies. Triple blind refers to the fact that the patient participants in the study won't be aware of which arm of the trial they're in, whether they're getting the usual care or experimental condition. Neither will the researchers who are assessing whether the patients are getting better or not, and neither will the family physicians who are being prompted to take action in either that sort of generic way or in that tailored patient specific way, prompting them to consider the mental health screening results and act on that information in accordance with clinical practice guidelines.
Quick clarification. Wouldn't the patients know which group they're in depending on the kind of information they're getting from their family physician? And same for the family physician if they're prompted to give more information about the treatments and the mental health problems that may occur post-concussion, wouldn't that no longer be blinded?
So there's always a risk that patients and other people involved in the study will be able to sort of figure it out or guess. We've taken a number of measures to try to limit that from happening. So when patients sign up for the study, they know they're going to fill out some questionnaires. They know they're going to get a package of information. They don't know what's in that package of information. They don't actually really know what the study is about, other than looking at how to support family physicians improve the quality of concussion care. So whether they receive a package that gives them just general education about concussion as the usual care arm, or one that is more specific to mental health problems, they only know what they got and not what anyone else got.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, so Thalia, in your PhD research, you are researching psychosocial barriers to concussion recovery?
Yes, so I guess that broadly defines my research, but my projects will be very closely related to the M4 trial, but more from the patient perspective rather than the provider perspective. So, say that Noah's trial is perfectly implemented at that provider level, and we have the majority of family doctors screen for and implement care for mental health for those patients who need it after concussion. Um, the patients need to accept that to perceive the need for mental health in order for the intervention to be as successful as it can be, and not just the intervention, but in general. If they don't perceive a need for mental health, they might not follow it, or if they don't agree with the type of mental health care they're receiving, they might not follow through with it. So what I'm trying to explore is that patient perspective, and trying to find out what they know about mental health after concussion, what preferences they might have about treatment, just so eventually we can learn more about those needs and match the delivery of mental health care to those needs.
Okay, and I assume you have multiple studies in your PhD. I'm not sure how far you're at, but can you give us more detail on how you're going to work with those patients directly? Like, what are the steps?
Sure. Well, the first study that I'm going to conduct is a qualitative study of not patients in the M4 trial, but other patients who have had a prolonged concussion recovery at some point, and ask them about, just very open-ended general questions like what do you know about mental health after concussion? Do you think you experienced some mental health problems after concussion? Did you feel a need for treatment? What kind of treatment you got? And just try to get more of a lay of the land there of what patients generally know and need in terms of mental health after concussion. And then for consequent studies, I will use the M4 trial. Those are studies that still need to be fully defined. So maybe I'll talk about those next time.
I have a question. Obviously, you haven't done the full study yet, but what do you think people are going to say on whether they think they've experienced mental health problems after a concussion, if they think they need help or extra support during this time? Like, what do you think people are going to say in these semi-structured interviews of your study?
Well, I definitely think there will be a range. And I'm answering this based on the fact that I've talked to a lot of people who have recovered from concussion, and I've generally, some people are very forthcoming or knowledgeable or aware that they did experience some mental health problems. Some people are less aware. Some people might be a bit resistant. I know I was. I know at some point it was suggested to me that, hey, maybe you're experiencing some anxiety, and I was very resistant to that idea. I mean, maybe there's a mental health stigma involved there. So I'm sure I'm going to get a wide range of answers, but I'm mostly interested to see in how these individuals, what kind of treatment they prefer. So, do they prefer medication? Do they prefer seeing a counselor, psychologist? Do they prefer more practical advice, how to return to their activities and such? So, yeah, I'm excited to see what we'll find out.
For the M4 project, Noah, what stage are you at right now then? And can you explain us, from your opinion, what the importance is of Thalias PhD project for this?
Sure. So the project launched recruitment back in March of this year. So we had to prepare and get it going during a worldwide pandemic, which was interesting. But one of the things that made that easier was that most hospitals we're recruiting from are on electronic medical record systems, and we can do a lot of that work remotely. So we've been recruiting since then, and I think we've enrolled about 200 patients so far. So not quite halfway towards our goal of 500 and change. So active recruitment phase. As far as the importance of Thalia's contributions, I think it is mainly about better understanding the patient's perspective in all of this. So we've been very focused on changing provider behavior and not paying a whole lot of attention to the patient's role. And of course, some more than others, but most patients play a big role in making decisions about what care they find acceptable or not, in pursuing that care, in sticking with it, even when it's not going super well. If it fails, being willing to try something else. So I think that's a sort of a big black hole area that we need to better understand. It may point us in the direction of how to make the knowledge translation intervention even more effective. So by maybe simultaneously targeting both providers and patients in a better way. And, in the worst case scenario, could help dissect a failed trial and help us understand why targeting providers didn't work as well as we thought it would.
So this whole intervention, because it's kind of rooted between changing a clinical guideline for family physicians, but also supporting those who experienced a concussion or a traumatic brain injury. Who are the kind of key stakeholders that you've worked with? How did you make sure that this intervention, the outcomes that you're looking at, are meaningful and not just what we think is important at the end of the day?
Yeah, we've done our best from the beginning to try to integrate both the theory of knowledge translation and the science behind it, and also some of the stakeholders that you mentioned, which include, for sure, patients themselves. So we have a couple of patient partners on our research team who have shared their input at every stage and contributed to all the sort of design choices as we went about designing the trial, and also through its implementation to make sure we're on track and that the study is set up to produce outcomes that they care about. We've also worked closely with family physicians, including Dr. Pierre-Paul Lizotte, who's been a part of our research team from the beginning, because, of course, they are not just passive recipients of the knowledge that we'll generate, but they're really integral to making this guideline implementation tool work. We've also been working with emergency department providers. They're sort of the front lines. That's typically how patients will enter the healthcare system, and just because of the way that we're recruiting for the study, that's true for all of them. And we also have some ongoing conversations with other entities, guideline developers, foundations that are involved in guideline development, insurers like WorkSafe BC and ICBC, who have an interest in making sure patients are getting the best care that they can in a consistent manner. So all those.
Can you tell us about an example of feedback or input that a patient partner or family physician that you have on the research team kind of changed what you originally had planned, or just how you incorporated that?
Yeah, so in the experimental arm, patients receive, rather than just generic information about concussion, they receive some more information specific about mental health complications and treatment options. So we put together a decision aid, which is used in a lot of different studies as a way of presenting to patients who hear the choices and some important things that you might want to know about it. And our patient partners didn't like it at all and had a lot of good suggestions for taking out detail, adding some things that they think they would want to know about that weren't including some visual aids, changing the color scheme, all kinds of things. And then similarly, we had the letter that goes out to the family physicians in the study to share their patients' mental health screening test results and what action they should consider taking. And our family doc said it has to fit on one page, otherwise they won't read it. It also has to say action required in large, bold, all cap letters at the top of the page. Otherwise, they won't do anything with it. So the ethics board didn't actually allow us to do that. It says action recommended in the end. That's as far as we could take it, but we tried.
Okay, that's a great example. And what about on the family physician side? So they should proactively screen and initiate treatment for concussion symptoms, right? So what is their feedback? Can you tell us about the willingness on their side of implementing this new practice?
Yeah, we don't know a whole lot about that. So we did a qualitative study prior, interviewing a bunch of family docs about their perceptions around mental health care complications. And, they brought up things that we didn't think about and also don't have great solutions to as part of this study. So one of the concerns that they raised there was about just access through the public health system for psychological therapy. So sure, the clinical practice guidelines say, this is the first line treatment. If you have a patient who you think has a depression or major depressive disorder, you should refer them to a psychologist for cognitive behavioral therapy. But that's easier said than done. There just isn't a lot of that available in our public healthcare system.
And Thalia, I know we keep going back to the fact that you personally experienced a concussion, but you have personally experienced it, and you also have patient stakeholders as part of the research team. So kind of taking information from both your personal experience, anecdotal experience, as well as your involvement on the research team. In your perspective, why are having stakeholders important, and especially having that patient perspective on a research team?
Sure. Well, I think I kind of alluded to this in my previous answer, but there is maybe either a lack of awareness or a stigma towards mental health after concussion or in general. So I think it can be a bit of a tricky subject to address sometimes. So I think the patient perspective will be especially important in finding out ways to be sensitive about it or find effective ways of explaining the role that mental health can have in concussion recovery, just so we can be more effective in delivering this information and this care for patients who might be less aware or a bit more resistant of the involvement of mental health after concussion.
I mean, the main goal is to, of course, have kind of a system change here and for family doctors to implement a new practice. But do you think there's a way of digitalizing this project in the future and, for example, use an app to share information about concussion and something like that?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is. So when we started this work in the sort of piloting phase, there was a lot of paper involved, and we've been able, and manual labor. We've been able to incorporate technology to improve the efficiency and I think ultimately the scalability of this kind of intervention. So we hired a software design firm, for example, to automate. So when patients do their mental health screening, that's now all done online. The software pulls in their responses and populates a templated letter that goes to the family physician. And then it's faxed to their office electronically with a single button press. So that's the only manual bit left. And what's funny is, with all these technological advancements, family doctors are still receiving information by fax. So I think it then gets scanned and uploaded into their electronic medical records, but there's some funny leftovers of technology that's almost obsolete, but not quite.
Okay. And we always love wrapping up these episodes with the ultimate vision and how you see this in the future. So, Noah, in the grand scheme of things, where do you see this project being 10, 15 years down the road, especially from that kind of more healthcare service, physician perspective?
Yeah, I don't know that I can think that far ahead. Maybe I'll go 5, 7 years ahead if that's okay.
I'll take it.
So what seems achievable is, assuming this intervention works. Let's please. Family doctors could have patients do a mental health screening like from an iPad in the waiting room or even in a virtual visit, right? That could be pushed out online. And then that sort of software I was describing that takes their responses to a questionnaire and tallies them and provides this interpretation and pulls in relevant practice guidelines based on their screening test results could just pop up on the physician's screen as they're inputting into the MR with the patient in front of them. And so our focus now is on mental health complications after concussion. We thought that would provide the most sort of bang for the buck in terms of improving patient outcomes. But certainly there are other concussion management best practices that need to also find their way more consistently in concussion care and could be incorporated into a system like the one I've described. Oh, and flying cars too.
Okay, that sounds like a vision. So for Thalia, you're focusing more on the patient. Can you give us a wrap up with saying more about what's the vision for the patient, maybe in your PhD, or what you see for the patient in the long term?
I think the most important part is societal awareness of the prevalence of mental health after concussion. That will help. That's not really specific to this project, but just, in concussion research in general. And that will help, I think, in the long run for patients to be more aware that this is a problem that they can develop. And make it easier for them to address it with available treatment modalities that we have. So I think that's the vision I have, just more awareness in general about the prevalence of mental health after concussion.
I love how both of your goals are both ambitious but feasible, keeping it very smart, very realistic. So with that brings us to the end of our episode today. It was lovely talking more about the M4 trial, concussions in general, as well as their next steps, their vision of flying cars. And it was great having both Noah and Thalia join us for our episode. Be sure to check out the description below and we'll leave their contact info in case you want to get in touch and learn more about this trial or have any questions.
That's it for today, right from the heart of Vancouver. Thanks to UBC AMS for supporting this podcast.
Keep in touch in the meanwhile on Twitter @RaincoatPodcast. Till next time.
Stay dry and stay safe.